Hello friends, welcome to Medical Duo. In this video, we will read chapter 21 of 11th NCERT, Neural Control and Coordination. And also, we learn the important point regarding NEET exam. So without further delay, let us start the chapter Neural Control and Coordination. As you know, the functions of the organ system in our body must be coordinated to maintain homeostasis. Coordination is the process through which two or more organs interact and complement the function of one another. For example, when we do physical exercise, the energy demand is increased for maintaining an increased muscular activity. The supply of oxygen is also increased. The increased supply of oxygen necessitates an increase in the rate of respiration, heartbeat, and increased blood flow by blood vessels. When physical exercise is stopped, the activity of nerve, lung, heart, and kidney gradually return to their normal condition. Thus, the function of muscle, lung, heart, blood vessel, kidney, and other organs are coordinated while performing physical exercise. In our body, the neural system and the endocrine system jointly coordinate and integrate all the activities of the organ so that they function in a synchronized fashion. The neural system provides an organized network of point-to-point connection for a quick coordination. The endocrine system provides chemical integration through hormones. In this chapter, you will learn about the neural system of human, mechanism of neural coordination like transmission of nerve impulse conduction across a synapse, and the physiology of reflex action. Let us see the neural system. The neural system of all animals is composed of highly specialized cells called neurons, which can detect, receive, and transmit different kinds of stimuli. The neural organization is very simple in lower invertebrate. For example, in Hydra, it is composed of a network of neurons. The neural system is better organized in insect, where a brain is present along with a number of ganglia and neural tissue. The vertebrates have a more developed neural system. Human neural system. The human neural system is divided into two parts, the central nervous system, and second is the peripheral nervous system, that is CNS and PNS. The central nervous system includes the brain and the spinal cord and is the site of information processing and control. The peripheral nervous system comprises of all the nerves of the body associated with the CNS, brain, and spinal cord. The nerve fibers of the peripheral nervous system are of two types. First is afferent fiber, second is efferent fiber. The afferent nerve fiber transmit impulses from tissue organ to the CNS. Afferent taking away towards the CNS, and the efferent fibers transmit regulatory impulse from the CNS to the concerned peripheral tissue or organ. You have to remember in this way that afferent means away towards the CNS and for efferent opposite of the above. The peripheral nervous system is divided into two divisions called somatic neural system and autonomic neural system. The somatic neural system relays impulses from the central nervous system to skeletal muscles, while the autonomous nervous system transmits impulses from the central nervous system to the involuntary organs and smooth muscles of the body. The autonomous neural system is further classified into sympathetic neural system and parasympathetic neural system. Visceral nervous system is the part of peripheral nervous system that comprises the whole complex of nerve, fibers, ganglia, and plexus, by which impulses travel from the central nervous system to the viscera and from the viscera to the central nervous system. Neuron as structural and functional unit of neural system. A neuron is a microscopic structure composed of three major parts, namely cell body, dendrites, and axon. The cell body contains cytoplasm with typical cell organelles and certain granular bodies called Nissensen's granules. Short fibers which branch repeatedly and project out of the cell body also contain Nissen's granules and are called dendrites. These fibers transmit impulses towards the cell body. The axon is a long fiber. Axon, which is a long fiber. Here they have represented the axon. The distal end of which is branched. Each branch terminates as a bulb-like structure called a synaptic knob, which possesses synaptic vesicle containing chemicals called neurotransmitters. The axon transmits nerve impulses away from the cell body to a synapse or to neuromuscular junction. Based on the number of axons and dendrites, the neurons are divided into three types, that is, multipolar with one axon and two or more dendrites found in cerebral cortex. Bipolar. Multipolar means one axon and dendrites may be two or more. And in the example of multipolar is cerebral cortex. You have to remember the example is very important regarding exam point of view. Bipolar with one axon and one dendrite found in the retina of eye. Bipolar neuron is found in retina of eye, while unipolar cell body with one axon only. There is no dendrite in unipolar neuron, found usually in the embryonic stage. There are two types of axon, namely myelinated and non-myelinated. The myelinated nerve fibers are enveloped with Schwann cells, which form a myelin sheath around the axon. The gap between two adjacent myelin sheaths are called the nodes of Ranvier. Myelinated nerve fibers are found in spinal and cranial nerves. Unmyelinated nerve fibers is enclosed by Schwann cells that does not form a myelin sheath around the axon. Unmyelinated means Schwann cells are present but they do not secrete myelin sheath around the axon and is commonly found in autonomous and the somatic neural system. Here they have represented the structure of a neuron, dendrites. In dendrites, there presents granular structure called nucleus and granules, cell body, nucleus, Schwann cell, axon, myelin sheath, nodes of Ranvier, axon terminal, synaptic knob. Let us see the generation and conduction of nerve impulse. Neurons are excitable cells because their membrane are in a polarized state. Do you know why the membrane of a neuron is polarized? Different types of ion channels are present on the neural membrane. These ion channels are selectively permeable to different ions. When a neuron is not conducting any impulse, that is resting, the axonal membrane is comparatively more permeable to calcium ion. At resting stage, axon membranes are more permeable to calcium ions K+, and nearly impermeable to sodium ion Na+. Similarly, the membrane is impermeable to negatively charged protein present in the exoplasm. Consequently, the exoplasm inside the axon contains high concentration of K+ and negatively charged protein and low concentration of sodium. In contrast, the fluid outside the axon contains a low concentration of potassium and high concentration of sodium and thus form a concentration gradient. This ionic gradient across the resting membrane are maintained by the active transport of ions by the sodium-potassium pump, which transport 3 sodium outward for 2 potassium into the cell. As a result, the outer surface of the axonal membrane possesses a positive charge, while its inner surface becomes negatively charged and thereby is polarized. The electrical potential difference across the resting plasma membrane is called a resting potential. You might be curious to know about the mechanism of generation of nerve impulse and its conduction along an axon. When a stimulus is applied at a site, figure 21.2.a, here is the impulse applied and its conduction along. When the stimulus is applied at a site on the polarized membrane, the membrane at the site A becomes freely permeable to sodium ions. This leads to rapid influx of sodium followed by the reversal of the polarity at that site. That is, the outer surface of the membrane become negatively charged and the inner side become positively charged. The polarity of the membrane at the site A is thus reversed and hence depolarized. The electrical potential difference across the plasma membrane at the site A is called the action potential, which is the fact termed as nerve impulse. At sites immediately ahead the axon, example site B, membrane has a positive charge on the outer surface and a negative charge on its inner surface. As a result, a current flow on the inner surface from site A to site B. On the outer surface, current flow from site B to site A to complete the circuit of current flow. Hence, the polarity at the site is reversed and an action potential is generated at site B. Thus, the impulse action potential generated at site A arises at site B. The sequence is repeated along the length of the axon and consequently the impulse is conducted. The rise in the stimulus induced permeability of sodium plus is extremely short-lived. It is quickly followed by a rise in permeability of potassium within a fraction of a second. Potassium diffuses outside the membrane and restores the resting potential of the membrane at the site of excitation, and the fiber become once more responsive to further stimulation. Let us see the transmission of impulse. A nerve impulse is transmitted from one neuron to another through junctions called a synapse. A synapse is formed by the membranes of a presynaptic neuron and a postsynaptic neuron, which may or may not be separated by a gap called a synaptic cleft. There are two types of synapse, namely electrical synapse and chemical synapses. At electrical synapses, the membrane of pre- and postsynaptic neuron are in very close proximity. Electrical current can flow directly from one neuron into the another across the synapses. Transmission of an impulse across the electrical synapse is very similar to impulse conduction along a single axon. Impulse transmission across an electrical synapse is always faster than that across a chemical synapse. Electrical synapses are rare in our system. At a chemical synapse, the membranes of the pre- and postsynaptic neurons are separated by a fluid-filled space called a synaptic cleft. Figure 21.3 showing axon terminal and synapse. Here they have represented axon terminal, synaptic vesicle, presynaptic membrane, synaptic cleft, gap between this postsynaptic membrane, receptor, and these three combined form synapse. Do you know how the presynaptic neuron transmits an impulse action potential across the synaptic cleft to the postsynaptic neuron? Chemicals called neurotransmitters are involved in the transmission of impulse at these synapses. The axon terminals contain vesicles filled with this neurotransmitter. When an impulse action potential arises at the axon terminal, it stimulates the movement of the synaptic vesicle toward the membrane where they fuse with the plasma membrane and release their neurotransmitter in the synaptic cleft. The released neurotransmitter bind to their specific receptor present on the postsynaptic membrane. This binding opens ion channels, allowing the entry of ions which can generate a new potential in the postsynaptic neuron. The new potential developed may be either excitatory or inhibitory. Let us see the central nervous system. The brain is the central information processing organ of our body and acts as the command and control system. It controls the voluntary movement, balance of the body, functioning of the vital involuntary organs, example lungs, hearts, kidney, etc. Thermoregulation, hunger and thirst, circadian 24-hour rhythm of our body, activities of several endocrine glands and human behavior It is also the site for processing of vision, hearing, speech, memory, intelligence, emotions, and thoughts. The human brain is well protected by the skull. Inside the skull, the brain is covered by cranial meninges, consisting of an outer layer called a dura mater, a very thin middle layer called arachnoid, and an inner layer which is in contact with the brain tissue called a pia mater. The brain can be divided into three major parts: forebrain, midbrain, and hindbrain. Here they have diagrammatic representation of human brain. Here they represented the cerebrum, cerebellum, medulla oblongata, cerebrum, thalamus, hypothalamus, pons, medulla. Forebrain include cerebrum, thalamus, and hypothalamus, while hindbrain include pons, cerebellum, and medulla. Midbrain include only midbrain. Let us see the forebrain. The forebrain consists of cerebrum, thalamus, and hypothalamus, as we seen in the diagram. The cerebrum forms the major part of the human brain. A deep cleft divides the cerebrum longitudinally into two halves, which are termed as the left and right cerebral hemisphere. The hemispheres are connected by a tract of nerve fibers called a corpus callosum. The layer of the cells which cover the cerebral hemisphere is called a cerebral cortex and is thrown into prominent folds. The cerebral cortex is referred to as the grey matter due to its greyish appearance. The neuron cell bodies are concentrated here, giving the color. The cerebral cortex contains motor area, sensory area, and a large that are neither sensory nor motor. This region is called as association area, are responsible for complex functions like intersensory association, memory, and communication. Fibers of the tract are covered with the myelin sheath, which constitute the inner part of the cerebral hemisphere. They give an opaque white appearance to the layer and hence is called white matter. The cerebrum wraps around a structure called a thalamus, which is a major coordinating center for sensory and motor signaling. Another very important part of the brain called a hypothalamus lies at the base of the thalamus. The hypothalamus contains a number of centers which control body temperature, urge for eating and drinking. It also contains several groups of neurosecretory cells which secrete hormones called hypothalamic hormones. The inner part of cerebral hemisphere and a group of associated deep structure like amygdala, hippocampus, etc. form a complex structure called the limbic lobe or limbic system. Along with the hypothalamus, it is involved in the regulation of sexual behavior, expression of emotional reaction, example, excitement, pleasure, rage, fear, and motivation. Let us see the midbrain. The midbrain is located between the thalamus, hypothalamus of the forebrain and pons of the hindbrain. A canal called a cerebral aqueduct passes through the midbrain. The dorsal portion of the midbrain consists mainly of four round swelling lobes called corpora quadrigemina. Hindbrain. The hindbrain comprises pons, cerebellum, and medulla, also called the medulla oblongata. Pons consist of fiber tracts that interconnect different regions of the brain. Cerebellum has very convoluted surface in order to provide the additional space for many neurons. The medulla of the brain is connected to the spinal cord. The medulla contains centers which control respiration, cardiovascular reflexes, and gastric secretion. Three major regions make up the brainstem: midbrain, pons, and medulla make the brainstem. Brainstem forms the connection between the brain and spinal cord. Let us see the reflex action and reflex arc. You must have experienced a sudden withdrawal of a body part which comes in contact with objects that are extremely hot, cold, pointed, or animals that are scary or poisonous. The entire process of response to a peripheral nervous stimulation that occurs involuntarily, that is without conscious effort or thought and require the involvement of a part of the central nervous system is called a reflex action. The reflex pathway comprises at least one afferent neuron receptor and one efferent effector or exciter neuron, appropriately arranged in a series. Figure 15.1 represents this. The afferent neuron receives signal from a sensory organ and transmits the impulse via dorsal nerve root into the central nervous system at the level of spinal cord. The efferent neuron then carries signals from central nervous system to the effector. The stimulus and responses thus form a reflex arc as shown below. In the knee-jerk reflex, you should carefully study figure 21.5 to understand the mechanism of a knee-jerk reflex. Here, the diagrammatic representation of reflex action showing knee-jerk reflex. First, the stimulus received by the muscle spindle receptor. Through afferent pathway, they reach the dorsal root ganglion and after that they reach the gray matter, which is inside the white matter. Here has an interneuron junction. And through motor neuron, the stimulus with the help of effector pathway reach the motor end plate, that is effector, and the response is produced. Let us see the sensory receptor and processing. Have you ever thought how do you feel the climatic changes in the environment? How do you see an object and its color? How do you hear a sound? The sensory organ detect all types of changes in the environment and send appropriate signal to the central nervous system where all the input are processed and analyzed. Signals are then sent to different centers of the brain. This is how you can sense changes in the environment. Let us see the sense organs. We smell things by nose, taste by tongues, hear by ears, and see objects by eyes. The nose contains mucus-coated receptors which are specialized for receiving the sense of smell and called olfactory receptor. Receptors in nose are called olfactory receptor which receive smell. These are made up of olfactory epithelium that consist of three kinds of cells. The neurons of the olfactory epithelium extend from the outside environment directly into a pair of broad bean-sized organs called olfactory bulb, which are extension of the brain's limbic system. But nose and tongue detect dissolved chemicals. The chemical sense of gustation, taste, and olfactory smell are functionally similar and interrelated. The tongue detects taste through taste buds containing gustatory receptors. With each taste of food or sip of drink, the brain integrates the differential input from the taste buds and a complex flavor is perceived. In the following section, you will be introduced to the structure and functioning of the eye, sensory organ for vision, and the ear, the sensory organ for hearing. Let us see the eye. Our paired eyes are located in the socket of the skull called the orbit. A brief account of structure and function of the human eye is given in the following sections. Let us see the part of an eye. The adult human eyeball is nearly a spherical structure. The wall of the eyeball is composed of three layers. Figure 21.6 represents the three layers parts of eye which include cornea, outermost part of the eye, cornea, then aqueous chamber between the cornea and lens, and vitreous chamber is between the lens and retina. Here is the fovea, blind spot. Here is the visual acuity maximum in the region of fovea, where blind spot. There is no visual activity in blind spot. Optic nerve, choroid, sclera, retina, vitreous chamber, and here they represented the ciliary body. The external layer is composed of a dense connective tissue and is called the sclera. The anterior portion of this layer is called the cornea. The middle layer, choroid. First layer is sclera, then cornea, and the middle layer is choroid. Contain many blood vessels and look bluish in color. Choroid contain many blood vessels and look bluish in color. The choroid layer is thin over the posterior. Choroid is thin over 2/3 of the eyeball, but it becomes thick in the anterior part to form the ciliary body. The ciliary body itself continues forward to form a pigmented and opaque structure called the iris, which is the visible colored portion of the eye. The eyeball contains a transparent crystalline lens which is held in place by the ligament attached to the ciliary body. In front of the lens, the aperture surrounded by the iris is called the pupil. The diameter of the pupil is regulated by the muscle fibers of iris. Diameter of pupil is regulated by muscle fibers of iris. This statement is important regarding exam point of view. The inner layer is the retina and it contains 3 layers of neural cells from inside to outside. Inside layer is ganglionic cell, then bipolar cell and photoreceptor cells. Outermost cells are photoreceptor cells and innermost cells are ganglionic cells. There are 2 types of photoreceptor cells, namely rods and cones. These cells contain the light-sensitive protein called the photopigment. The daylight, photopic vision, and color vision are function of cones, and the twilight, scotopic vision is the function of the rods. The rods contain a purplish red protein called the rhodopsin or visual purple, which contain a derivative of vitamin A. In the human eye, there are 3 types of cones which possess their own characteristic photopigment that respond to red, green, and blue lights. The sensation of different color are produced by various combination of these cones and their photopigment. When these cones are stimulated equally, a sensation of white light is produced. The optic nerve leaves the eye and the retinal blood vessel enter it at a point medial to the slightly above the posterior pole of the eyeball. The photoreceptor cells are not present in that region and hence it is called the blind spot. At the posterior pole of the eye lateral to the blind spot there is a yellowish pigmented spot called a macula lutea with a central pit called the fovea. The fovea is the thinned out portion of the retina where only the cones are densely packed up. It is the point where the visual acuity resolution is the greatest. The space between the cornea and the lens is called a aqueous chamber and contains a thin watery fluid called the aqueous humor. The space between the lens and the retina is called the vitreous chamber and is filled with a transparent gel called the vitreous humor. Let us see the mechanism of vision. The light ray is in visible wavelength focused on the retina through the cornea and lens generate potentials, impulses in rods and cones as mentioned earlier. The photosensitive compound photopigments in the human eye is composed of opsin, a protein, and retinal and aldehyde of vitamin A. Light induces dissociation of the retinal from opsin resulting in change in the structure of the opsin. This causes membrane permeability changes. As a result, potential differences are generated in the photoreceptor cells. This produces signal that generate action potential in the ganglionic cell through the bipolar cells. These action potential impulses are transmitted by the optic nerve to the visual cortex area of the brain, where the neural impulses are analyzed and the image formed on the retina is recognized based on earlier memory and experience. Let us see the ear. The ears perform 2 sensory functions, hearing and maintenance of the body balance. Anatomically, the ear can be divided into 3 major sections called the outer ear, the middle ear and the inner ear. Figure 21.7. Diagrammatic view of ear. Here they have represented the external pinna, then the external auditory canal, tympanic membrane, 3 bones malleus incus stapes in oval window, cochlea, cochlear nerve, eustachian tube, and temporal bone. The outer ear consists of the pinna and external auditory meatus canal. The pinna collects the vibration in the air which produces sound. The external auditory meatus lead inward and extend up to the tympanic membrane, the eardrum. There are very fine hairs and wax-secreting glands in the skin of the pinna and the meatus. The tympanic membrane is composed of connective tissue covered with skin outside and with mucous membrane inside. The middle ear contains 3 ossicles called malleus incus stapes, which are attached to one another in a chain-like fashion. The malleus is attached to the tympanic membrane and the stapes is attached to the oval window of the cochlea. The air ossicle increases the efficiency of transmission of sound waves to the inner ear. An eustachian tube connects the middle ear cavity with the pharynx. The eustachian tube helps in equalizing the pressure on either side of the eardrum. The fluid-filled inner ear, called a labyrinth, consists of 2 parts, the bony and the membranous labyrinth. The bony labyrinth is a series of channels. Inside these channels lies the membranous labyrinth, which is surrounded by a fluid called perilymph. The membranous labyrinth is filled with a fluid called endolymph. The coiled portion of the labyrinth is called cochlea. The membranous consisting cochlea, the racinars and basilar, divided the surrounding perilymph-filled bony labyrinth into an upper scala vestibula and a lower scala tympani. The space within cochlea, called scala media, is filled with endolymph at the base of the cochlea. The scala vestibula end at the oval window, while the scala tympani terminate at the round window, which open to the middle ear. Let us see the diagrammatic representation of the sectional view of cochlea. Here they have represented the scala vestibula, scala media, and scala tympani. Here is a tectorial membrane, basilar membrane, organ of corti, and racinars membrane. The organ of corti is a structure located on the basilar membrane which contain hair cells that act as auditory receptors. The hair cells are present in rows on the internal side of the organ of corti. The basal end of the hair cells is in close contact with the afferent nerve fibers. A large number of processes called stereocilia are projected from the apical part of each hair cell above the row of the hair cells in a thin elastic membrane called a tectorial membrane. The inner ear also contains a complex system called a vestibular apparatus located above the cochlea. The vestibular apparatus is composed of 3 semicircular canals and the otolith. Macula is the sensory part of sacula and utricle. Each semicircular canal lie in a different plane at right angle to each other. The membranous canals are suspended in the perilymph of the bony canal. The base of the canal is swollen and is called ampulla, which contain a projecting ridge called crista ampullaris, which has hair cells. The sacula and utricles contain a projecting ridge called macula. The crista and macula are the specific receptor of the vestibular apparatus responsible for maintenance of balance of the body and posture. Let us see the mechanism of hearing. How does ear convert sound wave into neural impulses, which are sensed and processed by the brain, enabling us to recognize a sound? The external ear receives sound waves and directs them to the eardrum. The eardrum vibrates in response to the sound waves, and these vibrations are transmitted through the ear ossicles, malleus incus and stapes to the oval window. The vibrations are passed through the oval window onto the fluid of the cochlea, where they generate waves in the lymph. The waves in the lymph induce a ripple in the basilar membrane. This movement of the basilar membrane bends the hair cell, pressing them against the tectorial membrane. As a result, nerve impulses are generated in the associated afferent neurons. These impulses are transmitted by the afferent fibers via auditory nerve to the auditory cortex of the brain. where the impulses are analyzed and the sound is recognized. Let us see the last part of this chapter, summary of neural control and coordination. The neural system coordinate and integrate functions as well as metabolic and homeostatic activity of all organs. Neurons, the functional unit of neural system, are excitable cells due to a differential concentration gradient of ions across the membrane. The electrical potential difference across the resting neural membrane is called the resting potential. The nerve impulse is conducted along the axon in the form of wave of depolarization and repolarization. A synapse is formed by the membranes of the presynaptic neuron and a postsynaptic neuron, which may or may not be separated by a gap called a synaptic cleft. Chemicals involved in transmission of impulse at chemical synapse are called neurotransmitters. Human neural system consists of two parts: central nervous system, peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system consists of the brain and spinal cord. The brain can be divided into three major parts: forebrain, midbrain, and hindbrain. The forebrain consists of cerebrum, thalamus, and hypothalamus. Cerebrum is longitudinally divided into two halves that are connected by the corpus callosum. A very important part of the forebrain called hypothalamus controls the body temperature, eating, and drinking. Inner part of cerebral hemisphere and a group of associated deep structure form a complex structure called a limbic system, which is concerned with olfaction, autonomic response, regulation of sexual behavior, expression of emotional reaction, and motivation. The midbrain receives and integrates visual, tactile, and auditory input. The hindbrain comprises pons, cerebellum, and medulla. The cerebellum integrates information received from the semicircular canal to the ear and the auditory system. The medulla contains centers which control respiration, cardiovascular reflexes, and gastric secretion. Pons consist of fibers tracts that interconnect different regions of the brain. The entire process of involuntary response to a peripheral nervous stimulation is called a reflex action. Information regarding changes in the environment is received by the central nervous system through the sensory organs, which are processed and analyzed. Signals are then sent for necessary adjustment. The wall of the human eyeball is composed of three layers. The external layer is composed of cornea and sclera. Inside the sclera is the middle layer, which is called the choroid. Retina, the innermost layer, contains two types of photoreceptor cells, namely rods and cones. The daylight, photopic vision, and color vision are function of cones, and twilight, scotopic vision, is the function of the rod. The light enters through cornea, the lens, and the images of objects are formed on the retina. The air can be divided into outer air, the middle air, and the inner air. The middle air contains three ossicles called malleus, incus, stapes. The fluid-filled inner air is called the labyrinth, and the coiled portion of the labyrinth is called cochlea. The organ of corti is a structure which contains hair cells that act as auditory receptor and is located on the basilar membrane. The vibration produced in the eardrum are transmitted through the air ossicle and oval window to the fluid-filled inner air. Nerve impulses are generated and transmitted by the afferent fibers to the auditory cortex of the brain. The inner ear also contains a complex system located above the cochlea called a vestibular apparatus. It is influenced by gravity and movements and helps us in maintaining balance of the body and posture. In this way, we completed the reading and explanation of some parts of the chapter Neural Control and Coordination. For more update, subscribe to Medical Duo. Thank you.